Sections 17 and 18 of 100% The Story of a Patriot by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 17. It had been arranged for Guffey that at the end of a week Peter was to have a secret meeting with one of the chief detective's men. So Peter told the girls that he was tired of being a prisoner in the house and must get some fresh air. "Oh, please, Mr. Gudge, don't take such a chance!" cried Sadie, her thin, anxious face suddenly growing more anxious and thin. "Don't you know this house is being watched? They are just hoping to catch you out alone. It would be the last of you." "I'm not so important as that," said Peter. But she insisted that he was, and Peter was pleased, in spite of his boredom. He liked to hear her insist upon his importance. "Oh," she cried, "don't you know yet how much depends on you as a witness for the Goober defense? This case is of concern to millions of people all over the world. It is a test case, Mr. Gudge. Are they to be allowed to murder the leaders of the working class without a struggle? No, we must show them that there is a great movement, a worldwide awakening of the workers, a struggle for freedom for the wage slaves." But Peter could stand no more of this. "All right," he said, suddenly interrupting Sadie's eloquence. "I suppose it's my duty to stay, even if I die of consumption, being shut up without any fresh air." He would play the martyr, which was not so hard, for he was one, and looked like one, with his thin, one-sided little figure, and his shabby clothes. Both Sadie and Jennie gazed at him with admiration, and sighed with relief. But later on Peter thought of an idea. He could go out at night, he told Sadie, and slip out the back way so that no one would see him. He would not go into crowds or brightly lighted streets, so there would be no chance of his being recognized. There was a fellow he absolutely had to see who owed him some money. It was way over on the other side of the city, that was why he rejected Jennie's offer to accompany him. So that evening Peter climbed a back fence and stole through a neighbor's chicken yard and got away. He had a fine time ducking and dodging in the crowds, making sure that no one was trailing him to his secret rendezvous, who might chance to be suspicious of his comradeship. It was in the American House, an obscure hotel, and Peter was to take the elevator to the fourth floor, without speaking to anyone, and to tap 3 times on the door of room 427. Peter did so, and the door opened and he slipped in, and there he met Jerry McGivney, with the face of a rat. "Well, what have you got?" demanded McGivney, and Peter sat down and started to tell. With eager fingers he undid the amateur sewing in the lining of his coat, and pulled out his notes with the names and descriptions of people who had come to see him. McGivney glanced over them quickly. "Jesus!" he said. "What's the good of all this?" "Well, but they're Reds!" exclaimed Peter. "I know," said the other, "but what of that? We can go hear them spout at meetings any night. We got membership lists of these different organizations. But what about the Goober case?" "Well," said Peter, "they're agitating about it all the time. They've been printing stuff about me." "Sure, we know that," said McGivney. "And the hell of a fine story you gave them. You must have enjoyed hearing yourself talk. But what good does that do us?" "But what do you want to know?" cried Peter in dismay. "We want to know their secret plans," said the other. "We want to know what they're doing to get our witnesses. We want to know who it is that is selling us out, who's the spy in the jail. Didn't you find that out?" "No," said Peter. "Nobody said anything about it." "Good God!" said the detective. "Do you expect them to bring you things on a silver tray?" He began turning over Peter's notes again, and finally threw them on the bed in disgust. He began questioning Peter, and Peter's dismay turned to despair. He had not got a single thing that McGivney wanted. His whole week of sleuthing had been wasted. The detective did not mince words. "It's plain that you're a boob," he said. "But such as you are, we've got to do the best we can with you. Now put your mind on it and get it straight. We know who these Reds are, and we know what they're teaching. We can't send 'em to jail for that. What we want you to find out is the name of their spy, and who are the witnesses in the Goober case, and what they're going to say." "But how can I find out things like that?" cried Peter. "You've got to use your wits," said McGivney. "But I'll give you one tip. Get yourself a girl." "A girl?" cried Peter in wonder. "Sure thing," said the other. "That's the way we always work. Guffey says there's just 3 times when people tell their secrets. The first is when they're drunk, and the second is when they're in love." Then McGivney stopped. Peter, who wanted to complete his education, inquired, "And the third?" "The third is when they're both drunk and in love," was the reply. And Peter was silent, smitten with admiration. This business of sleuthing was revealing itself as more complicated and more fascinating all the time. "Ain't you seen any girl you fancy in that crowd?" demanded the other. "Well, it might be," said Peter, shyly. "It ought to be easy," continued the detective. "Them Reds are all free lovers, you know." "Free lovers?" exclaimed Peter. "How do you mean?" "Didn't you know about that?" laughed the other. Peter sat staring at him. All the women that Peter had ever known or heard of took money for their love. They either took it directly, or they took it in the form of automobile rides, and flowers, and candy, and tickets to the Whangdoodle things. Could it be that there were women who did not take money in either form, but whose love was entirely free? The detective assured him that such was the case. "They boast about it," he said. "They think it's right." And to Peter that seemed the most shocking thing he had yet heard about the Reds. To be sure, when he thought it over, he could see that it had some redeeming points. It was decidedly convenient from the point of view of the man. It was so much money in his pocket. If women chose to be that silly, and Peter found himself suddenly thinking about little Jennie Todd. Yes, she would be that silly, it was plain to see. She gave away everything she had, so of course she would be a free lover. Peter went away from his rendezvous with McGivney, thrilling with a new and wonderful idea. You couldn't have got him to give up his job now. This sleuthing business was the real thing. It was late when Peter got home, but the two girls were sitting up for him, and their relief at his safe return was evident. He noticed that Jennie's face expressed deeper concern than her sister's, and this gave him a sudden new emotion. Jennie's breath came and went more swiftly because he had entered the room, and this affected his own breath in the same way. He had a swift impulse towards her, an entirely unselfish desire to reassure her and relieve her anxiety. But with an instinctive understanding of the sex game, which he had not before known he possessed, he checked this impulse and turned instead to the older sister, assuring her that nobody had followed him. He told an elaborate story, prepared on the way. He had worked for 10 days for a fellow at sawing wood, hard work, you bet, and then the fellow had tried to get out of paying him. Peter had caught him at his home that evening, and had succeeded in getting $5 out of him, and a promise of a few dollars more every week. That was to cover future visits to McGivney. Section 18. Peter lay awake a good part of the night, thinking over this new job, that of getting himself a girl. He realized that for some time he had been falling in love with little Jennie. But he wanted to be sane and practical, he wanted to use his mind in choosing a girl. He was after information, first of all. And who had the most to give him? He thought of Miss Nebbins, who was secretary to Andrews, the lawyer. She would surely know more secrets than anyone else, but then Miss Nebbins was an old maid, who wore spectacles and broad-toed shoes, and was evidently out of the question for love-making. Then he thought of Miss Standish, a tall blonde beauty who worked in an insurance office and belonged to the Socialist Party. She was a swell dresser, and Peter would have been glad to have something like that to show off to McGivney and the rest of Guffey's men. But with the best efforts of his self-esteem, Peter could not imagine himself persuading Miss Standish to look at him. There was a Miss Yankovich, one of the real Reds, who trained with the I.W.W. But she was a Jewess with sharp black eyes that clearly indicated a temper, and frightened Peter. Also, he had a suspicion that she was interested in McCormick, though of course with these free lovers you could never tell. But one girl Peter was quite sure about, and that was little Jennie. He didn't know if Jennie knew many secrets, but surely she could find some out for him. Once he got her for his own, he could use her to question others. And so Peter began to picture what love with Jennie would be like. She wasn't exactly what you would call "swell," but there was something about her that made him sure he needn't be ashamed of her. With some new clothes she would be pretty, and she had grand manners. She had not shown the least fear of the rich ladies who came to the house in their automobiles. Also, she knew an awful lot for a girl, even if most of what she knew wasn't so. Peter lost no time in setting to work at his new job. In the papers next morning appeared the usual details from Flanders. Thousands of men being shot to pieces almost every hour of the day and night, 1,000,000 men on each side locked in a ferocious combat that had lasted for weeks, that might last for months. And sentimental little Jennie sat there with brimming eyes, talking about it while Peter ate his oatmeal and thin milk. And Peter talked about it too, how wicked it was, and how they must stop it, he and Jennie together. He agreed with her now, he was a Socialist. He called her comrade, and told her she had converted him. Her eyes lighted up with joy, as if she had really done something to end the war. They were sitting on the sofa, looking at the paper, and they were alone in the house. Peter suddenly looked up from the reading and said, very much embarrassed, "But, Comrade Jennie—" "Yes?" she said, and looked at him with her frank gray eyes. Peter was shy, truly a little frightened, this kind of detective business being new to him. "Comrade Jennie," he said, I don't know just how to say it, but I'm afraid I'm falling a little in love." Jennie drew back her hands, and Peter heard her breath come quickly. "Oh, Mr. Gudge!" she exclaimed. I don't know," stammered Peter. "I hope you won't mind." "Oh, don't let's do that!" she cried. "Why not, Comrade Jennie?" And he added, "I don't know as I can help it." "Oh, we were having such a happy time, Mr. Gudge. I thought we were going to work for the cause." "Well, but it won't interfere—" "Oh, but it does, it does! It makes people unhappy." "Then," and Peter's voice trembled, "then you don't care the least bit for me, Comrade Jennie?" She hesitated a moment. "I don't know," she said. "I hadn't thought—" And Peter's heart gave a leap inside him. It was the first time that any girl ever had to hesitate in answering that question for Peter. Something prompted him, just as if he had been doing this kind of sleuthing all his life. He reached over and very gently took her hand. "You do care just a little for me?" he whispered. "Oh, Comrade Gudge!" she answered, and Peter said, "Call me Peter, please, please do." "Comrade Peter," she said, and there was a little catch in her throat, and Peter, looking at her, saw that her eyes were cast down. "I know I'm not very much to love," he pleaded. "I'm poor and obscure, I'm not good looking—" "Oh, it isn't that!" she cried. "Oh, no, no! Why should I think about such things? You are a comrade." Peter had known, of course, just how she would take this line of talk. "Nobody has ever loved me," he said sadly. "Nobody cares anything about you when you're poor and have nothing to offer." "I tell you that isn't it," she insisted. "Please don't think that. You are a hero. You have sacrificed for the cause, and you are going on and become a leader." "I hope so," said Peter modestly. "But then, what is it, Comrade Jennie? Why don't you care for me?" She looked up at him, and their eyes met, and with a little sob in her voice she answered, "I'm not well, Comrade Peter. I'm of no use. It would be wicked for me to marry." Somewhere back in the depths of Peter, where his inner self was crouching, it was as if a sudden douche of ice cold water were let down on him. Marry! Who had said anything about marrying? Peter's reaction fitted the stock phrase of the comic papers. "This is so sudden." But Peter was too clever to reveal such dismay. He humored little Jennie, saying, "We don't have to marry right away. I could wait, if only I knew that you cared for me, and some day when you get well—" She shook her head sadly. "I'm afraid I'll never get really well, and besides, neither of us have any money, Comrade Peter." Ah, there it was! Money, always money! This free love was nothing but a dream. "I could get a job," said Peter, "just like any other tame and conventional wooer." "But you couldn't earn enough for two of us," protested the girl, and suddenly she sprang up. "Oh, Comrade Peter, let's not fall in love with each other. Let's not make ourselves unhappy. Let's work for the cause. Promise me that you will." Peter promised, but of course he had no remotest intention of keeping the promise. He was not only a detective, he was a man, and in both capacities he wanted Comrade Jennie. And over the addressing of envelopes which he undertook with her, he would now and then steal love glances, and Jennie knew now what these looks meant, and the faint flush would creep over her cheeks and down into her neck and throat. She was really very pretty when she was falling in love, and Peter found his new job the most delightful one of his lifetime. He watched carefully and noted the signs, and was sure he was making no mistake. Before Sadie came back at supper time, he had his arms about Comrade Jenny, and was pressing kisses upon the lovely white throat, and Comrade Jenny was sobbing softly, and her pleading with him to stop had grown faint and unconvincing. End of sections 17 and 18. Sections 19 and 20 of 100% The Story of a Patriot by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 19. There was the question of Sadie to be settled. There was a certain severe look that sometimes came about Sadie's lips, and that caused Peter to feel absolutely certain that Comrade Sadie had no sympathy with free love, and very little sympathy with any love save her own for Jenny. She had nursed her little sister and tended her like a mother for many years. She took the food out of her mouth to give to Jenny, and Jenny in turn gave it to any wandering agitator who came along and hung around until meal time. Peter didn't want Sadie to know what had been going on in her absence, and yet he was afraid to suggest to Jenny that she should deceive her sister. He managed it very tactfully. Jenny began pleading again. "We ought not to do this, Comrade Peter." And so Peter agreed, perhaps they oughtn't, and they wouldn't any more. So Jenny put her hair in order, and straightened her blouse, and her lover could see that she wasn't going to tell Sadie. And the next day they were kissing again and agreeing again that they mustn't do it, and so once more Jenny didn't tell Sadie. Before long Peter had managed to whisper the suggestion that their love was their own affair, and they ought not to tell anybody for the present. They would keep the delicious secret, and it would do no one any harm. Jenny had read somewhere about a woman poet by the name of Mrs. Browning, who had been an invalid all her life, and whose health had been completely restored by a great and wonderful love. Such a love had now come to her, only Sadie might not understand. Sadie might think they did not know each other well enough, and that they ought to wait. They knew, of course, that they really did know each other perfectly, so there was no reason for uncertainty or fear. Peter managed deftly to put these suggestions into Jenny's mind as if they were her own. And all the time he was making ardent love to her. All day long, while he was helping her address envelopes and mail out circulars for the Goober Defense Committee. He really did work hard. He didn't mind working when he had Jenny at the table beside him, and could reach over and hold her hand every now and then, or catch her in his arms and murmur passionate words. Delicious thrills and raptures possessed him. His hopes would rise like a flood tide, but then, alas, only to ebb again. He would get so far, and every time it would be as if he had to run into a stone wall. No farther. Peter realized that McGivney's free love talk had been a cruel mistake. Little Jenny was like all the other women, her love wasn't going to be free. Little Jenny wanted a husband, and every time you kissed her, she began right away to talk about marriage, and you dared not hint at anything else, because you knew it would spoil everything. So Peter was thrown back upon devices older than the teachings of any Reds. He went after little Jenny, not in the way of free lovers, but in the way of a man alone in the house with a girl of 17, and wishing to seduce her. He vowed that he loved her with an overwhelming and eternal love. He vowed that he would get a job and take care of her. And then he let her discover that he was suffering torments. He could not live without her. He played upon her sympathy. He played upon her childish innocence. He played upon that pitiful, weak sentimentality which caused her to believe in pacifism and altruism and socialism and all the other isms that were jumbled up in her head. And so in a couple of weeks Peter had succeeded in his purpose of carrying little Jenny by storm. And then, how enraptured he was! Peter, with his first girl, decided that being a detective was the job for him. Peter knew that he was a real detective now, using the real inside methods, and on the trail of the real secrets of the Goober case. And sure enough, he began at once to get them. Jenny was in love. Jenny was, as you might say, drunk with love. And so she fulfilled both the conditions which Guffey had laid down. So Jenny told the truth. Sitting on Peter's knee, with her arms clasped about him, and talking about her girlhood, the happy days before her mother and father had been killed in the factory where they worked, little Jenny mentioned the name of a young man, Ibbetts. "Ibbetts?" said Peter. It was a peculiar name, and sounded familiar. "A cousin of ours," said Jenny. "Have I met him?" asked Peter, groping in his mind. "No, he hasn't been here." "Ibbetts?" he repeated, still groping, and suddenly he remembered. "Isn't his name Jack?" Jenny did not answer for a moment. He looked at her, and their eyes met, and he saw that she was frightened. "Oh, Peter," she whispered, "I wasn't to tell. I wasn't to tell a soul." Inside Peter something was shouting with delight. To hide his emotion he had to bury his face in the soft white throat. "Sweetheart," he whispered. "Darling." "Oh, Peter," she cried, "you know, don't you?" "Of course," he laughed, "but I won't tell. You needn't mind trusting me." "Oh, but Mr. Andrews was so insistent," said Jenny. "He made Sadie and me swear that we wouldn't breathe it to a soul." "Well, you didn't," said Peter. "I found it out by accident. Don't mention it, and nobody will be any the wiser. If they should find out that I know, they wouldn't blame you. They'd understand that I know Jack Ibbetts, me being in jail so long." So Jenny forgot all about the matter, and Peter went on with the kisses, making her happy, as a means of concealing his own exultation. He had done the job for which Guffey had sent him! He had solved the first great mystery of the Goober case. The spy in the jail of American City, who was carrying out news to the Defense Committee, was Jack Ibbetts, one of the keepers in the jail, and a cousin of the Todd sisters. Section 20. It was fortunate that this was the day of Peter's meeting with McGivney. He could really not have kept this wonderful secret to himself overnight. He made excuses to the girls, and dodged through the chicken yard as before, and made his way to the American House. As he walked, Peter's mind was working busily. He had really got his grip on the ladder of prosperity now. He must not fail to tighten it. McGivney saw right away from Peter's face that something had happened. "Well?" he inquired. "I've got it!" exclaimed Peter. "Got what?" "The name of the spy in the jail." "Christ! You don't mean it!" cried the other. "No doubt about it," answered Peter. "Who is he?" Peter clenched his hands and summoned his resolution. "First," he said, "you and me got to have an understanding. Mr. Guffey said I was to be paid, but he didn't say how much or when." "Oh, hell!" said McGivney. "If you've got the name of that spy, you don't need to worry about your reward." "Well, that's all right," said Peter, "but I'd like to know what I'm to get, and how I'm to get it." "How much do you want?" demanded the man with the face of a rat. Rat-like, he was retreating into a corner, his sharp black eyes watching his enemy. "How much?" he repeated. Peter had tried his best to rise to this occasion. Was he not working for the greatest and richest concern in American City, the Traction Trust? Tens and hundreds of millions of dollars they are worth. He had no idea how much, but he knew they could afford to pay for his secret. "I think it ought to be worth $200, he said. "Sure," said McGivney. "That's all right. We'll pay you that." And straightway Peter's heart sank. What a fool he had been! Why hadn't he had more courage, and asked for $500? He might even have asked 1,000, and made himself independent for life. "Well," said McGivney, "who's the spy?" Peter made an agonizing effort, and summoned yet more nerve. "First I got to know, when do I get that money?" "Oh, good God!" said McGivney. "You give us the information and you'll get your money all right. What kind of cheapskates do you take us for?" "Well, that's all right," said Peter. "But you know, Mr. Guffey didn't give me any reason to think he loved me. I still can hardly use this wrist like I used to." "Well, he was trying to get some information out of you," said McGivney. "He thought you were one of them dynamiters. How could you blame him? You give me the name of that spy, and I'll see that you get your money." But still Peter wouldn't yield. He was afraid of the rat-faced McGivney, and his heart was thumping fast, but he stood his ground. "I think I ought to see that money," he said doggedly. "Say, what the hell do you take me for?" demanded the detective. "Do you suppose I'm going to give you $200, and then have you give me some fake name and skip?" "Oh, I wouldn't do that!" cried Peter. "How do I know you wouldn't?" "Well, I want to go on working for you." "Sure, and we want you to go on working with us. This ain't the last secret we'll get from you, and you'll find we play straight with our people. How'd we ever get anywheres otherwise? There's $1,000,000 been put up to hang that Goober crowd, and if you deliver the goods you'll get your share and get it right on time." He spoke with conviction, and Peter was partly persuaded. But most of Peter's lifetime had been spent in watching people bargaining with one another, watching scoundrels trying to outwit one another, and when it was a question of some money to be got, Peter was like a bulldog that has got his teeth fixed tight in another dog's nose. He doesn't consider the other dog's feelings, nor does he consider whether the other dog admires him or not. "On time?" said Peter. "What do you mean by on time?" "Oh, my God!" said McGivney in disgust. "Well, but I want to know," said Peter. "Do you mean when I give the name, or do you mean after you've gone and find out whether he really is the spy or not?" So they worried back and forth, these snarling bulldogs, growing more and more angry. But Peter was the one who had got his teeth in, and Peter hung on. Once McGivney hinted quite plainly that the Great Traction Trust had had power enough to shut Peter in the hole on 2 occasions and keep him there, and it might have power enough to do it a third time. Peter's heart failed with terror, but all the same he hung on to McGivney's nose. "All right," said the rat-faced man at last. He said it in a tone of wearied scorn, but that didn't worry Peter a particle. "All right, I'll take a chance with you." And he reached into his pocket and pulled out a roll of bills. $20 bills they were, and he counted out 10 of them. Peter saw that there was still a lot left to the roll, and he knew that he hadn't asked as much money as McGivney had been prepared to have him ask, so his heart was sick within him. At the same time his heart was leaping with exultation. Such a strange thing is the human heart. End of sections 19 and 20. Sections 21 and 22 of 100% The Story of a Patriot by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 21. McGivney laid the money on the bed. "There it is," he said, "and if you give me the name of the spy you can take it. But you'd better take my advice and not spend it, because if it turns out that you haven't got the spy, by God, I believe Ed Guffey'd twist the arms out of you." Peter was easy about that. "I know he's the spy, all right." "Well, who is he?" "He's Jack Ibbetts." "The devil you say!" cried McGivney, incredulously. "Jack Ibbetts, one of the night keepers in the jail." "I know him," said the other, "but what put that notion into your head?" "He's a cousin of the Todd sisters." "Who are the Todd sisters?" "Jennie Todd is my girl," said Peter. "Girl!" echoed the other. He stared at Peter, and a grin spread over his face. "You got a girl in 2 weeks? I didn't know you had it in you." It was a doubtful compliment, but Peter's smile was no less expansive, and showed all his crooked teeth. "I got her all right," he said, "and she blabbed it out the first thing. That Ebbets was her cousin. And then she was scared, because Andrews, the lawyer, had made her and her sister swear they wouldn't mention his name to a soul. So you see, they're using him for a spy. There ain't a particle of doubt about it." "Good God!" said McGivney, and there was genuine dismay in his tone. "Who'd think it possible? Why, Ibbetts is as decent a fellow as ever you talked to, and him a Red, and a traitor at that. You know, that's what makes it the devil, trying to handle these Reds. You never can tell who they'll get. You never know who to trust. How do you suppose they manage it?" "I dunno," said Peter. "There's a sucker born every minute, you know." "Well, anyhow, I see you ain't one of 'em," said the rat-faced man, as he watched Peter take the roll of bills from the bed and tuck them away in an inside pocket. Section 22. Peter was warned by the rat-faced man that he must be careful how he spent any of that money. Nothing would be more certain to bring suspicion on him than to have it whispered about that he was "in funds." He must be able to show how he had come honestly by everything he had. And Peter agreed to that. He would hide the money away in a safe place until he was through with his job. Then he in turn proceeded to warn McGivney. If they were to fire Ibbetts from his job, it would certainly cause talk, and might direct suspicion against Peter. McGivney answered with a smile that he wasn't born yesterday. They would promote Jack Ibbetts, giving him some job where he couldn't get any news about the Goober case. Then, after a bit, they would catch him up on some mistake, or get him into some trouble and fire him. At this meeting, and at later meetings, Peter and the rat-faced man talked out every aspect of the Goober case, which was becoming more and more complicated, and bigger as a public issue. New people were continually being involved, and new problems continually arising. It was more fascinating than a game of chess. McGivney had spoken the literal truth when he said that the big business interests of American City had put up $1 million to hang Goober and his crowd. At the very beginning there had been offered $17,000 in rewards for information, and these rewards naturally had many claimants. The trouble was that people who wanted this money generally had records that wouldn't go well before a jury. The women nearly always turned out to be prostitutes, and the men to be ex-convicts, forgers, gamblers, or what not. Sometimes they didn't tell their past records until the other side unearthed them, and then it was necessary to doctor court records, and pull wires all over the country. There were a dozen such witnesses as this in the Goober case. They had told their stories before the grand jury, and innumerable flaws and discrepancies had been discovered, which made more work and trouble for Guffey and his lieutenants. Through a miserable mischance it happened that Jim Goober and his wife had been watching the parade from the roof of a building a couple of miles away, at the very hour when they were accused of having planted the suitcase with the bomb in it. Somebody had taken a photograph of the parade from this roof, which showed both Goober and his wife looking over, and also a big clock in front of a jewelry store, plainly indicating the very minute. Fortunately the prosecution got hold of this photograph first, but now the defense had learned of its existence, and was trying to get a look at it. The prosecution didn't dare destroy it, because its existence could be proven, but they had photographed the photograph, and rephotographed that, until they had the face of the clock so dim that the time could not be seen. Now the defense was trying to get evidence that this trick had been worked. Then there were all the witnesses for the defense. Through another mischance it had happened that half a dozen different people had seen the bomb thrown from the roof of Guggenheim's department store, which entirely contradicted the suitcase theory upon which the prosecution was based. So now it was necessary to reach these various witnesses. One perhaps had a mortgage on his home, which could be bought and foreclosed. Another perhaps had a wife who wanted to divorce him, and could be persuaded to help get him into trouble. Or perhaps he was engaged in an intrigue with some other man's wife. Or perhaps some woman could be sent to draw him into an intrigue. Then again it appeared that very soon after the explosion some of Guffey's men had taken a sledgehammer and smashed the sidewalk, also the wall of the building where the explosion had taken place. This was to fit in with the theory of the suitcase bomb, and they had taken a number of photographs of the damage. But now it transpired that somebody had taken a photograph of the spot before this extra damage had been done, and that the defense was in possession of this photograph. Who had taken this photograph, and how could he be fixed? If Peter could help in such matters, he would come out of the Goober case a rich man. Peter would go away from these meetings with McGivney with his head full of visions, and would concentrate all his faculties upon the collecting of information. He and Jennie and Sadie talked about the case incessantly, and Jennie and Sadie would tell freely everything they had heard outside. Others would come in, young McCormick and Miriam Yankovich, and Miss Nebbins, the secretary to Andrews, and they would tell what they had learned, and what they suspected, and what the defense was hoping to find out. They got hold of a cousin of the man who had taken the photograph on the roof. They were working on him, to get him to persuade the photographer to tell the truth. Next day Donald Gordon would come in, cast down with despair, because it had been learned that one of the most valuable witnesses of the defense, a grocery man, had once pleaded guilty to selling spoiled cheese. Thus every evening before he went to sleep, Peter would jot down notes, and sew them up inside his jacket, and once a week he would go to the meeting with McGivney, and the two would argue and bargain over the value of Peter's news. End of sections 21 and 22. Sections 23 and 24 of 100% The Story of a Patriot by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 23. It had become a fascinating game, and Peter would never have tired of it but for the fact that he had to stay all day in the house with little Jennie. A honeymoon is all right for a few weeks, but no man can stand it forever. Little Jennie apparently never tired of being kissed, and never seemed satisfied that Peter thoroughly loved her. A man got through with his love making after a while, but a woman, it appeared, never knew how to drop the subject. She was always looking before and after, and figuring consequences and responsibilities, her duty and her reputation and all the rest of it, which, of course, was a bore. Jennie was unhappy because she was deceiving Sadie. She wanted to tell Sadie, and yet somehow it was easier to go on concealing than admit that one had concealed. Peter didn't see why Sadie had to be told at all. He didn't see why things couldn't stay just as they were, and why he and his sweetheart couldn't have some fun now and then, instead of always being sentimental, always having agonies over the class war, to say nothing of the world war, and the prospects of America being involved in it. This did not mean that Peter was hard and feelingless. No, when Peter clasped trembling little Jennie in his arms, he was very deeply moved. He had a real sense of what a gentle and good little soul she was. He would have been glad to help her, but what could he do about it? The situation was such that he could not plead with her, he could not try to change her. He had to give himself up to all her crazy whims and pretend to agree with her. Little Jennie was by her weakness marked for destruction, and what good would it do for him to go to destruction along with her? Peter understood clearly that there were two kinds of people in the world, those who eat and those who are eaten, and it was his intention to stay among the former group. Peter had come in his 20 years of life to a definite understanding of the things called ideas and causes and religions. They were bait to catch suckers, and there is a continual competition between the suckers, who of course don't want to be caught, and those people of superior wits who want to catch them, and therefore are continually inventing new and more plausible and alluring kinds of bait. Peter had by now heard enough of the jargon of the "comrades" to realize that theirs was an especially effective kind, and here was poor little Jennie stuck fast on the hook, and what could Peter do about it? Yet this was Peter's first love, and when he was deeply thrilled, he understood the truth of Guffey's saying that a man in love wants to tell the truth. Peter would have the impulse to say to her, "Oh, drop all that preaching and give yourself a rest. Let's you and me enjoy life a bit." Yes, it would be all he could do to keep from saying this, despite the fact that he knew it would ruin everything. Once little Jennie appeared in a new silk dress, brought to her by one of the rich ladies whose heart was touched by her dowdy appearance. It was of soft gray silk, cheap silk, but fresh and new, and Peter had never had anything so fine in his arms before. It matched Jennie's gray eyes, and its freshness gave her a pink glow. Or was it that Peter admired her and loved her more, and so brought the blood to her cheeks? Peter had an impulse to take her out and show her off, and he pressed his face into the soft folds of the dress and whispered, "Say, kid, some day you and me gotta cut all this hard luck business for a bit." He felt little Jennie stiffen and draw away from him, so quickly he had to set to work to patch up the damage. "I want you to get well," he pleaded. "You're so good to everybody. You treat everybody well but yourself." It had been something in his tone rather than his actual words that had frightened the girl. "Oh, Peter," she cried, "what does it matter about me, or about any other one person, when millions of young men are being shot to fragments, and millions of women and children are starving to death?" So there they were, fighting the war again. Peter had to take up her burden, be a hero and a martyr and a Red. That same afternoon, as fate willed it, 3 "wobblies" out of a job came to call, and oh, how tired Peter was of these wandering agitators, insufferable grouches! Peter would want to say, "Oh, cut it out! What you call your cause is nothing but your scheme to work with your tongues instead of with a pick and shovel." And this would start an imaginary quarrel in Peter's mind. He would hear one of the fellows demanding, "How much pick and shovel work you ever done?" and another saying, "Looks to me like you been finding the easy jobs wherever you go." The fact that this was true did not make Peter's irritation any less, did not make it easier for him to meet with Comrade Smith and Brother Jones and fellow worker Brown just out of jail, and listen to their hard luck stories. and watch them take from the table food that Peter wanted, and, the bitterest pill of all, let them think that they were fooling him with their patter. The time came when Peter wasn't able to stand it any longer. Shut up in the house all day, he was becoming as irritable as a chained dog. Unless he could get out in the world again, he would surely give himself away. He pleaded that the doctors had warned him that his health would not stand indoor life. He must get some fresh air. So he got away by himself, and after that he found things much easier. He could spend a little of his money, he could find a quiet corner in a restaurant and get himself a beefsteak, and eat all he wanted of it, without feeling the eyes of any "comrades" resting upon him reprovingly. Peter had lived in a jail, and in an orphan asylum, and in the home of Shoemaker Smithers, but nowhere had he fared so meagerly as in the home of the Todd sisters, who were contributing nearly everything they owned to the Goober defense, and to the Clarion, the Socialist paper of American City. Section 24. Peter went to see Andrews, the lawyer, and asked for a job. He wanted to be active in the case, he said, so he was set to work in the offices of the Defense Committee, where he heard people talking about the case all day, and he could pick up no end of valuable tips. He made himself agreeable and gained friends. Before long he was intimate with one of the best witnesses of the defense, and discovered that this man had once been named as correspondent in a divorce case. Peter found out the name of the woman, and Guffey set to work to bring her to American City. The job was to be done cleverly, without the woman's even knowing that she was being used. She would have a little holiday, and the spell of old love would reassert itself, and Guffey would have a half dozen men to spring the trap, and there would be a star witness of the Goober defense clean down and out. "There's always something you can get them on," said McGivney, and cheerfully paid Peter Gudge $500 for the information he had brought. Peter would have been wildly happy, but just at this moment a dreadful calamity befell him. Jennie had been talking about marriage more and more, and now she revealed to him a reason which made marriage imperative. She revealed it with downcast eyes, with blushes and trembling, and Peter was so overcome with consternation that he could not play the part that was expected of him. Hitherto, in these love crises, he had caught Jennie in his arms and comforted her, but now for a moment he let her see his real emotions. Jennie promptly had a fit. What was the matter with him? Didn't he mean to marry her, as he had promised? Surely he must realize now that they could no longer delay. And Peter, who was not familiar with the symptoms of hysterics, lost his head completely, and could think of nothing to do but rush out of the house and slam the door. The more he considered it, the more clearly he realized that he was in the devil of a predicament. As a servant of the Traction Trust, he had taken it for granted that he was immune to all legal penalties and obligations. But here, he had a feeling, was a trouble from which the powerful ones of the city would be unable to shield their agent. Were they able to arrange it so that one could marry a girl and then get out of it when one's job was done? Peter was so uneasy that he had to call up the office of Guffey and get hold of McGivney. This was dangerous, because the prosecution was tapping telephone wires, and they feared the defense might be doing the same. But Peter took a chance. He told McGivney to come and meet him at the usual place. And there they argued the matter out, and Peter's worst fears were confirmed. When he put the proposition up to McGivney, the rat-faced man guffawed in his face. He found it so funny that he did not stop laughing until he saw that he was putting his spy into a rage. "What's the joke?" demanded Peter. "If I'm ruined, where'll you get any more information?" "But my God!" said McGivney, "what did you have to go and get that kind of a girl for?" "I had to take what I could," answered Peter. "Besides, they're all alike. They get into trouble and you can't help it." "Sure you can help it," said McGivney. "Why didn't you ask long ago? Now if you've got yourself tied up with a marrying proposition, it's your own lookout. You can't put it off on me." They argued back and forth. The rat-faced man was positive that there was no way Peter could pretend to marry Jennie and not have the marriage count. He might get himself into no end of trouble, and certainly he would be ruined as a spy. What he must do was to pay the girl some money, and send her somewhere to get fixed up. McGivney would find out the name of a doctor to do the job. "Yes, but what excuse can I give her?" cried Peter. "I mean, why I don't marry her." "Make something up," said McGivney. Why not have a wife already?" Then seeing Peter's look of dismay, "Sure, you can fix that. I'll get you one if you need her. But you won't have to take that trouble. Just tell your girl a hard luck story. You've got a wife. You thought you could get free from her, but now you find you can't. Your wife's got wind of what you're doing here, and she's trying to blackmail you. Fix it up so your girl can't do anything on account of hurting the Goober defense. If she's really sincere about it, she won't disgrace you. Maybe she won't even tell her sister." Peter hated to do anything like that. He had a vision of little Jennie lying on the sofa in hysterics as he left her, and he dreaded the long emotional scene that would be necessary. However, it seemed that he must go through with it. There was no better way that he could think of. Also, he must be quick, because in a couple of hours Sadie would be coming home from work, and it might be too late. End of sections 23 and 24. Sections 25 and 26 of 100% The Story of a Patriot by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 25. Peter hurried back to the Todd home, and there was white-faced little Jennie lying on the bed, still sobbing. One would think she might have used up her surplus stock of emotions, but no, there is never any limit to the emotions a woman can pour out. As soon as Peter had got fairly started on the humiliating confession that he had a wife, little Jennie sprang up from the bed with a terrified shriek, and confronted him with a face like the ghost of an escaped lunatic. Peter tried to explain that it wasn't his fault. He had really expected to be free any day. But Jennie only clasped her hands to her forehead and screamed, "You have deceived me! You have betrayed me!" It was just like a scene in the movies. The bored little devil inside Peter was whispering. He tried to take her hand and reason with her, but she sprang away from him. She rushed to the other side of the room and stood there, staring at him as if she were some wild thing that he had in a corner and was threatening to kill. She made so much noise that he was afraid that she would bring the neighbors in. He had to point out to her that if this matter became public, he would be ruined forever as a witness, and thus she might be the means of sending Jim Goober to the gallows. Thereupon Jennie fell silent, and it was possible for Peter to get in a word. He told her of the intrigues against him. The other side had sent somebody to him and offered him $10,000 if he would sell out the Goober defense. Now, since he had refused, they were trying to blackmail him, using his wife. They had somehow come to suspect that he was involved in a love affair, and this was to be the means of ruining him. Jennie still would not let Peter touch her, but she consented to sit down quietly in a chair and figure out what they were going to do. Whatever happened, she said, they must do no harm to the Goober case. Peter had done her a monstrous wrong in keeping the truth from her, but she would suffer the penalty, whatever it might be. She would never involve him. Peter started to explain. Perhaps it wasn't so serious as she feared. He had been thinking things over. He knew where Pericles Priam, his old employer, was living, and Pericles was rich now, and Peter felt sure that he could borrow $200, and there were places where little Jennie could go, there were ways to get out of this trouble. But little Jennie stopped him. She was only a child in some ways, but in others she was a mature woman. She had strange, fixed ideas, and when you ran into them it was like running into a stone wall. She would not hear of the idea Peter suggested. It would be murder. "Nonsense," said Peter, echoing McGivney. "It's nothing. Everybody does it." But Jennie was apparently not listening. She sat staring with her wild, terrified eyes, and pulling at her dress with her fingers. Peter got to watching these fingers, and they got on his nerves. They behaved like insane fingers. They manifested all the emotions which the rest of little Jennie was choking back and repressing. "If you would only not take it so seriously," Peter pleaded. "It's a miserable accident, but it's happened, and now we've got to make the best of it. Some day I'll get free. Some day I'll marry you." "Stop, Peter," the girl whispered in her tense voice. "I don't want to talk to you any more, if that's all you have to say. I don't know that I'd be willing to marry you, now that I know you could deceive me, that you could go on deceiving me day after day for months." Peter thought she was going to break out into hysterics again, and he was frightened. He tried to plead with her, but suddenly she sprang up. "Go away!"
she exclaimed. "Please go away and let me alone. I'll think it over and decide what to do myself. Whatever I do, I won't disgrace you, so leave me alone. Go quickly!"
Section 26. She drove him out of the house, and Peter went, though with many misgivings. He wandered about the streets, not knowing what to do with himself, looking back over the blunders he had made, and tormenting himself with that most tormenting of all thoughts: "How different my life might have been if only I had had sense enough to do this, or not to do that!" Dinner time came, and Peter blew himself to a square meal, but even that did not comfort him entirely. He pictured Sadie coming home at this hour. Was Jennie telling her or not? There was a big mass meeting called by the Goober Defense Committee that evening, and Peter attended. And it proved to be the worst thing he could have done. His mind was in no condition to encounter the fierce passions of this crowded assemblage. Peter had the picture of himself being exposed and denounced. He wasn't sure yet that it mightn't happen to him. And here was this meeting: thousands of workingmen, horny-handed blacksmiths, longshoremen with shoulders like barns, and truckmen with fists like battering rams, long-haired radicals of 100 dangerous varieties, women who waved red handkerchiefs and shrieked until to Peter they seemed like gorgons with snakes instead of hair. Such were the mob frenzies engendered by the Goober case. And Peter knew, of course, that to all these people he was a traitor, a poisonous worm, a snake in the grass. If ever they were to find out what he was doing, if, for instance, someone were to rise up and expose him to this crowd, they would seize him and tear him to pieces. And maybe, right now, little Jennie was telling Sadie, and Sadie would tell Andrews, and Andrews would become suspicious, and set spies on Peter Gudge. Maybe they had spies on him already, and knew of his meetings with McGivney. Haunted by such terrors, Peter had to listen to the tirades of Donald Gordon, of John Durand, and of Sorensen, the longshoremen's leader. He had to listen to exposure after exposure of the tricks which Guffey had played. He had to hear the district attorney of the county denounced as a suborner of perjury, and his agents as blackmailers and forgers. Peter couldn't understand why such things should be permitted, why these speakers were not all clapped into jail. But instead, he had to sit there and listen. He even had to applaud and pretend to approve. All the other secret operatives of the Traction Trust and of the district attorney's office had to listen and pretend to approve. In the hall Peter had met Miriam Yankovich, and was sitting next to her. "Look," she said, "there's a couple of dicks over there. Look at the mugs on them." "Which?" said Peter. And she answered, "That fellow who looks like a bruiser, and that one next to him with the face of a rat." Peter looked, and saw that it was McGivney, and McGivney looked at Peter, but gave no sign. The meeting lasted until nearly midnight. It subscribed several $1,000s to the Goober Defense Fund, and adopted ferocious resolutions which it ordered printed and sent to every local of every labor union in the country. Peter got out before it was over, because he could no longer stand the strain of his own fears and anxieties. He pushed his way through the crowd, and in the lobby he ran into Pat McCormick, the I.W.W. leader. There was more excitement in this boy's grim face than Peter had ever seen there before. Peter thought it was the meeting, but the other rushed up to him exclaiming, "Have you heard the news?" "What news?" "Little Jennie Todd has killed herself." "My God!" gasped Peter, starting back. "Ada Ruth just told me. Sadie found a note when she got home. Jennie had left, she was going to drown herself." "But why?" cried Peter in horror. "She was suffering so, her health was so wretched. She begged Sadie not to look for her body, not to make a fuss. They'll never find her." And horrified and stunned as Peter was, there was something inside him that drew a deep breath of relief. Little Jennie had kept her promise. Peter was safe. End of sections 25 and 26. Sections 27 and 28 of 100%, The Story of a Patriot by Upton SINCLAIR. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 27. Yes, Peter was safe, but it had been a close call, and he still had painful scenes to play his part in.
He had to go back to the Todd home and meet the frantic Sadie, and weep and be horrified with the rest of them. It would have been suspicious if he had not done this. The comrades would never have forgiven him. Then to his dismay he found that Sadie had somehow come to a positive conviction as to Jennie's trouble. She penned Peter up in a corner and accused him of being responsible. And there was poor Peter, protesting vehemently that he was innocent, and wishing that the floor would open up and swallow him. In the midst of his protestations a clever scheme occurred to him. He lowered his voice in shame. There was a young man, who used to come to see Jennie off and on. Jennie asked me not to tell. Peter hesitated a moment, and added his masterstroke. Jennie explained to me that she was a free lover. She told me all about free love. I told her I didn't believe in it, but you know, Sadie, when Jennie believed in anything, she would stand by it and act on it. So I felt certain it wouldn't do any good for me to butt in. Sadie almost went out of her mind at this. She glared at Peter. "Slanderer! Devil!" she cried. "Who was the man?" Peter answered, "He went by the name of Ned. That's what Jennie called him. It wasn't my business to pin her down about him." "It wasn't your business to look out for an innocent child?" "Jennie herself said she wasn't an innocent child. She knew exactly what she was doing. All Socialists did it." And to this parting shot he added that he hadn't thought it was decent, when he was a guest in a home, to spy on the morals of the people in it. When Sadie persisted in doubting him, and even in calling him names, he took the easiest way out of the difficulty, fell into a rage, and stormed out of the house. Peter felt pretty certain that Sadie would not spread the story very far. It was too disgraceful to her sister and to herself. And maybe, when she had thought it over, she might come to believe Peter's story. Maybe she herself was a free lover. McGivney had certainly said that all Socialists were, and he had been studying them a lot. Anyhow, Sadie would have to think first of the Goober case, just as little Jennie had done. Peter had them there all right, and realized that he could afford to be forgiving, so he went to the telephone and called up Sadie and said, "I want you to know that I'm not going to say anything about this story. It won't become known except through you." There were half a dozen people whom Sadie must have told. Miss Nebbins was icy cold to Peter the next time he came in to see Mr. Andrews. Also, Miriam Yankovich lost her formal cordiality, and several other women treated him with studied reserve. But the only person who spoke about the matter was Pat McCormick, the IWW boy who had given Peter the news of little Jennie's suicide. Perhaps Peter hadn't been able to act satisfactorily on that occasion, or perhaps the young fellow had observed something for himself, some love glances between Peter and Jennie. Peter had never felt comfortable in the presence of this silent Irish boy, whose dark eyes would roam from one person to another in the room, and seemed to be probing your most secret thoughts. Now Peter's worst fears were justified. Mac got him off in a corner, and put his fist under his nose, and told him that he was a dirty hound, and if it hadn't been for the Goober case, he, Mac, would kill him without a moment's concern. And Peter did not dare open his mouth. The look on the Irishman's face was so fierce that he was really afraid for his life. God, what a hateful lot these Reds were! And now here was Peter with the worst one of all against him. From now on his life would be in danger from this maniac Irishman. Peter hated him so heartily and genuinely that it served to divert his thoughts from little Jennie, and to make him regard himself as a victim. Yes, in the midnight hours, when Jennie's gentle little face haunted him, and his conscience attacked him, Peter looked back upon the tangled web of events, and saw quite clearly how inevitable this tragedy had been, how naturally it had grown out of circumstances beyond his control. The fearful labor struggle in American City was surely not Peter's fault, nor was it his fault that he had been drawn into it, and forced to act first as an unwilling witness, and then as a secret agent. Peter read the American City "Times" every morning, and knew that the cause of Goober was the cause of anarchy and riot, while the cause of the district attorney and of Guffey's Secret Service was the cause of law and order. Peter was doing his best in this great cause. He was following the instructions of those above him, and how could he be blamed because one poor weakling of a girl had got in the way of the great chariot of the law? Peter knew that it wasn't his fault, and yet grief and terror gnawed at him. For one thing, he missed little Jennie. He missed her by day and he missed her by night. He missed her gentle voice, her fluffy soft hair, her body in his empty arms. She was his first love, and she was gone, and it is human weakness to appreciate things most when they have been lost. Peter aspired to be a strong man, a he-man, according to the slang that was coming into fashion. He now tried to live up to that role. He didn't want to go mooning about over this accident, yet Jennie's face stayed with him, sometimes wild, as he had seen it at their last meeting, sometimes gentle and reproachful. Peter would remember how good she had been, how tender, how never failing in instant response to an advance of love on his part. Where would he ever find another girl like that? Another thing troubled him especially, a strange, inexplicable thing, for which Peter had no words, and about which he found himself frequently thinking. This weak, frail slip of a girl had deliberately given her life for her convictions. She had died in order that he might be saved as a witness for the Goobers. Of course Peter had known all along that little Jennie was doomed, that she was throwing herself away, that nothing could save her. But somehow it does frighten the strongest heart when people are so fanatical as to throw away their very lives for a cause. Peter found himself regarding the ideas of these Reds from a new angle. Before this they had been just a bunch of nuts, but now they seemed to him creatures of monstrous deformity, products of the devil, or of a god gone insane. Section 28. There was only one person whom Peter could take into his confidence, and that was McGivney. Peter could not conceal from McGivney the fact that he was troubled over his bereavement, and so McGivney took him in hand and gave him a jacking up. It was dangerous work, this of holding down the Reds, dangerous because their doctrines were so insidious, they were so devilishly cunning in their working upon people's minds. McGivney had seen more than one fellow start fooling with their ideas and turn into one himself. Peter must guard against that danger. "It ain't that," Peter explained. "It ain't their ideas. It's just that I was soft on that kid." "Well, it comes to the same thing," said McGivney. "You get sorry for them, and the first thing you know, you're listening to their arguments. Now, Peter, you're one of the best men I've got on this case, and that's saying a good deal, because I've got charge of 17." The rat-faced man was watching Peter and saw Peter flush with pleasure. Yes, he continued, Peter had a future before him. He would make all kinds of money. He would be given responsibility, a permanent position. But he might throw it all away if he got to fooling with these Red doctrines. And also, he ought to understand, he could never fool McGivney, because McGivney had spies on him. So Peter clenched his hands and braced himself up. Peter was a real he-man, and wasn't going to waste himself. "It's just that I can't help missing the girl," he explained, to which the other answered, "Well, that's only natural. What you want to do is to get yourself another one." Peter went on with his work in the office of the Goober Defense Committee. The time for the trial had come, and the struggle between the two giants had reached its climax. The district attorney, who was prosecuting the case, and who was expecting to become governor of the state on the strength of it, had the backing of half a dozen of the shrewdest lawyers in the city, their expenses being paid by the big business men. A small army of detectives were at work, and the court where the trial took place was swarming with spies and agents. Every one of the hundreds of prospective jurors had been investigated and card catalogued, his every weakness and every prejudice recorded. Not merely had his psychology been studied, but his financial status, and that of his relatives and friends. Peter had met half a dozen other agents besides McGivney, men who had come to question him about this or that detail. And from the conversation of these men he got glimpses of the endless ramifications of the case. It seemed to him that the whole of American City had been hired to help send Jim Goober to the gallows. Peter was now getting $50 a week and expenses, in addition to special tips for valuable bits of news. Hardly a day passed that he didn't get wind of some important development, and every night he would have to communicate with McGivney. The prosecution had a secret office, where there was a telephone operator on duty, and couriers traveling to the district attorney's office and to Guffey's office, all this to forestall telephone tapping. Peter would go from the headquarters of the Goober Defense Committee to a telephone booth in some hotel, and there he would give the secret number, and then his own number, which was 642. Everybody concerned was known by numbers, the principal people both of the prosecution and of the defense. The name Goober was never spoken over the phone. After the trial had got started, it was hard to get anybody to work in the office of the defense committee. Everybody wanted to be in court. Someone would come in every few minutes with the latest reports of sensational developments. The prosecution had succeeded in making away with the police court records, proving the conviction of its star witness of having kept a brothel for negroes. The prosecution had introduced various articles alleged to have been found on the street by the police after the explosion. One was a spring, supposed to have been part of a bomb, but it turned out to be a part of a telephone. Also, they had introduced parts of a clock, but it appeared that in their super zeal they had introduced the parts of two clocks. There was some excitement like this every day. End of sections 27 and 28. Sections 29 and 30 of 100% The Story of a Patriot by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 29. The time came when the prosecution closed its case, and Peter was summoned to the office of Andrews to be coached in his part as a witness. He would be wanted in 2 or 3 days, the lawyers told him. Now Peter had never intended to appear as a witness. He had been fooling the defense all this time, stringing them along, as he phrased it, so as to keep in favor with them to the end. Meantime he had been figuring out how to justify his final refusal. Peter was eating his lunch when this plan occurred to him, and he was so much excited that he swallowed a piece of pie the wrong way, and had to jump up and run out of the lunchroom. It was his first stroke of genius. Hitherto it was McGivney who had thought these things out, but now Peter was on the way to becoming his own boss. Why should he go on taking orders when he had such brains of his own? He took the plan to McGivney, and McGivney called it a peach, and Peter was so proud he asked for a raise, and got it. This plan had the double advantage that not merely would it save Peter's prestige and reputation among the Reds, it would ruin McCormick, who was one of the hardest workers for the defense, and one of the most dangerous Reds in American City, as well as being a personal enemy of Peter's. McGivney pulled some of his secret wires, and the American City "Times," in the course of its accounts of the case, mentioned as a rumor that the defense proposed to put on the stand a man who claimed to have been tortured in the city jail, in an effort to make him give false testimony against Goober. The prosecution had investigated this man's record, and discovered that only recently he had seduced a young girl, and she had killed herself because of his refusal to marry her. Peter took this copy of the American City "Times" to the office of David Andrews, and insisted upon seeing the lawyer before he went to court. He laid the item on the desk, and declared that there was his finish as a witness in the Goober case. "It's a cowardly, dirty lie," he declared, "and the man responsible for circulating it is Pat McCormick." Such are the burdens that fall upon the shoulders of lawyers in hard-fought criminal trials. Poor Andrews did his best to patch things up. He pleaded with Peter. If the story was false, Peter ought to be glad of a chance to answer his slanderers. The defense would put witnesses on the stand to deny it. They would produce Sadie Todd to deny it. "But Sadie told me she suspected me." "Yes," said Andrews, "but she told me recently she wasn't sure." "Much good that'll do me," retorted Peter. "They'll ask me if anybody ever accused me, and who, and I'll have to say McCormick. And if they put him on the stand, will he deny that he accused me?" Peter flew into a rage against McCormick. A fine sort of radical he was, pretending to be devoted to the cause, and having no better sense than to repeat a cruel slander against a comrade. Here Peter had been working on this case for nearly 6 months, working for barely enough to keep body and soul together, and now they expected him to go on and have a story like that brought out in the papers, and have the prosecution hiring witnesses to prove him a villain. "No, sir," said Peter, "I'm through with this case right now. You put McCormick on the witness stand, and let him save Goober's life. You can't use me. I'm out." And shutting his ears to the lawyer's pleading, he stormed out of the office, and over to the office of the Goober Defense Committee, where he repeated the same scene. Section 30. Thus Peter was done with the Goober case, and mighty glad of it he was. He was tired of the strain, he needed a rest and a little pleasure. He had his pockets stuffed with money, and a good fat bank account, and proposed to take things easy for the first time in his hard and lonely life. The opportunity was at hand, for he had taken McGivney's advice and got himself another girl. It was a little romance, very worldly and delightful. To understand it, you must know that in the judicial procedure of American City they used both men and women jurors, and because busy men of affairs did not want to waste their time in the jury box, nor to have the time of their clerks and working men wasted, there had gradually grown up a class of men and women who made their living by working as jurors. They hung around the courthouse, and were summoned on panel after panel, being paid $6 a day, with numerous opportunities to make money on the side if they were clever. Among this group of professional jurors there was the keenest competition to get into the jury box of the Goober case. It was to be a long and hard fought case, there would be a good deal of prestige attached to it, and also there were numerous sums of money floating around. Anybody who got in, and who voted right, might be sure of an income for life, to say nothing of a life job as a juror if he wanted it. Peter happened to be in court while the talismen were being questioned. A very charming and petite brunette, what Peter described as a "swell dresser," was on the stand, and was cleverly trying to satisfy both sides. She knew nothing about the case, she had never read anything about it, she knew nothing and cared nothing about social problems. So she was accepted by the prosecution. But then the defense took her in hand, and it appeared that once upon a time she had been so indiscreet as to declare to somebody her conviction that all labor leaders ought to be stood up against the wall and filled with lead. So she was challenged by the defense, and very much chagrined she came down from the stand and took a seat in the courtroom next to Peter. He saw a trace of tears in her eyes, and realizing her disappointment, ventured a word of sympathy. The acquaintance grew, and they went out to lunch together. Mrs. James was her name, and she was a widow, a grass widow as she archly mentioned. She was quick and lively, with brilliant white teeth, and cheeks with the glow of health in them. This glow came out of a little bottle, but Peter never guessed it. Peter had got himself a good suit of clothes now, and made bold to spend some money on the lunch. As it happened, both he and Mrs. James were through with the Goober case. Both were tired and wanted a change, and Peter, blushing slightly, suggested that a sojourn at the beach might be fun. Mrs. James agreed immediately, and the matter was arranged. Peter had seen enough of the detective business by this time to know what you can safely do and what you had better not do. He didn't travel with his grass widow, he didn't pay her car fare, nor do anything else to constitute her a "white slave." He simply went to the beach and engaged himself a comfortable apartment, and next day, strolling on the boardwalk, he happened to meet the widow. So for a couple of months Peter and Mrs. James set up housekeeping together. It was a wonderful experience for the former, because Mrs. James was what is called a lady, she had rich relatives, and took pains to let Peter know that she had lived in luxury before her husband had run away to Paris with a tight-rope walker. She taught Peter all those worldly arts which one misses when one is brought up in an orphan asylum and on the road with a patent medicine vendor. Tactfully, and without hurting his feelings, she taught him how to hold a knife and fork, and what color tie to select. At the same time she managed to conduct a propaganda which caused him to regard himself as the most favored of mankind. He was overwhelmed with gratitude for every single kiss from the lips of his grass widow. Of course he could not expect such extraordinary favors of fortune without paying for them. He had learned by now that there was no such thing as free love. So he paid, hand over fist. He not only paid all the expenses of the unregistered honeymoon, he bought numerous expensive presents at the lady's tactful suggestion. She was always so vivacious and affectionate when Peter had given her a present. Peter lived in a kind of dream. His money seemed to go out of his pockets without his having to touch it. Meantime, great events were rolling by, unheeded by Peter and his grass widow, who never read the newspapers. For one thing, Jim Goober was convicted and sentenced to die on the gallows, and Jim Goober's associate, Biddle, was found guilty and sentenced to prison for life. Also, America entered the war, and a wave of patriotic excitement swept like a prairie fire over the country. Peter could not help hearing about this. His attention was attracted to one aspect of the matter. Congress was about to pass a conscription act, and Peter was within the age limit. Peter would almost certainly be drafted into the army. No terror that he had ever felt in his life was equal to this terror. He had tried to forget the horrible pictures of battle and slaughter, of machine guns and hand grenades and torpedoes and poison gas, with which little Jennie had filled his imagination. But now these imaginings came crowding back upon him. Now for the first time they concerned him. From that time on his honeymoon was spoiled. Peter and his grass widow were like a party of picnickers who are far away in the wilderness, and see a black thunderstorm come rolling up the sky. Also, Peter's bank account was running low. Peter had had no conception how much money you could spend on a grass widow who is a swell dresser and understands what is proper. He was overwhelmed with embarrassment. He put off telling Mrs. James until the last moment. In fact, until he wasn't quite sure whether he had enough money in bank to meet the last check he had given to the landlady. Then, realizing that the game was up, he told. He was surprised to see how charmingly a grass widow of good breeding could take bad tidings. Evidently it wasn't the first time that Mrs. James had been to the beach. She smiled cheerfully and said that it was the jury box for her once more. She gave Peter her card, and told him she would be glad to have him call upon her again, when he had restored his fortunes. She packed up her suitcase and her new trunk full of Peter's presents, and departed with the most perfect sweetness and good taste. End of sections 29 and 30. Sections 31 and 32 of 100% The Story of a Patriot by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 31. So there was Peter, down and out once more. But fate was kind to him. That very day came a letter signed 243, which meant McGivney. 243 had some important work for Peter, so would he please call at once. Peter pawned his last bit of jewelry for his fare to American City, and met McGivney at the usual rendezvous. The purpose of the meeting was quickly explained. America was now at war, and the time had come when the mouths of these Reds were to be stopped for good. You could do things in wartime that you couldn't do in peacetime, and one of the things you were going to do was to put an end to the agitation against property. Peter licked his lips, metaphorically speaking. It was something he had many times told McGivney ought to be done. Pat McCormick especially ought to be put away for good. These were a dangerous bunch, these Reds, and Mac was the worst of all. It was every man's duty to help, and what could Peter do? McGivney answered that the authorities were making a complete list of all the radical organizations and their members, getting evidence preliminary to arrests. Guffey was in charge of the job. As in the Goober case, the big business interests of the city were going ahead, while the government was still wiping the sleep out of its eyes. Would Peter take a job spying upon the Reds in American City? "I can't!" exclaimed Peter. "They're all sore at me because I didn't testify in the Goober case." "We can easily fix that up," answered the rat-faced man. "It may mean a little inconvenience for you. You may have to go to jail for a few days." "To jail!" cried Peter in dismay. "Yes," said the other. "You'll have to get arrested and made into a martyr. Then, you see, they'll all be sure you're straight, and they'll take you back again and welcome you." Peter didn't like the idea of going to jail. His memories of the jail in American City were especially painful. But McGivney explained that this was a time when men couldn't consider their own feelings. The country was in danger, public safety must be protected, and it was up to everybody to make some patriotic sacrifice. The rich men were all subscribing to Liberty bonds. The poor men were going to give their lives. And what was Peter Gudge going to give? "Maybe I'll be drafted into the army," Peter remarked. "No, you won't, not if you take this job," said McGivney. "We can fix that. A man like you who has special abilities is too precious to be wasted." Peter decided forthwith that he would accept the proposition. It was much more sensible to spend a few days in jail than to spend a few years in the trenches. and maybe the balance of eternity under the sod of France. Matters were quickly arranged. Peter took off his good clothes, and dressed himself as became a working man, and went into the eating room where Donald Gordon, the Quaker boy, always got his lunch. Peter was quite sure that Donald would be one of the leading agitators against the draft, and in this he was not mistaken. Donald was decidedly uncordial in his welcoming of Peter. Without saying a word, the young Quaker made Peter aware that he was a renegade, a coward who had thrown down the Goober defense. But Peter was patient and tactful. He did not try to defend himself, nor did he ask any questions about Donald and Donald's activities. He simply announced that he had been studying the subject of militarism, and had come to a definite point of view. He was a socialist and an internationalist. He considered America's entry into the war a crime, and he was willing to do his part in agitating against it. He was going to take his stand as a conscientious objector. They might send him to jail if they pleased, or even stand him against a wall and shoot him, but they would never get him to put on a uniform. It was impossible for Donald Gordon to hold out against a man who talked like that, a man who looked him in the eye and expressed his convictions so simply and honestly. And that evening Peter went to a meeting of local American City of the Socialist Party, and renewed his acquaintance with all the comrades. He didn't make a speech or do anything conspicuous, but simply got into the spirit of things, and next day he managed to meet some of the members, and whenever and wherever he was asked, he expressed his convictions as a conscientious objector. So before a week had passed, Peter found that he was being tolerated, that nobody was going to denounce him as a traitor, or kick him out of the room. At the next weekly meeting of local American City, Peter ventured to say a few words. It was a red-hot meeting, at which the war and the draft were the sole subjects of discussion. There were some Germans in the local, some Irishmen, and one or two Hindus. They naturally were all ardent pacifists. Also there were agitators of what was coming to be called the "left wing," the group within the party who considered it too conservative, and were always clamoring for more radical declarations, for mass action, and general strikes and appeals to the proletariat to rise forthwith and break their chains. These were days of great events. The Russian Revolution had electrified the world, and these comrades of the left wing felt themselves lifted upon pinions of hope. Peter spoke as one who had been out on the road, meeting the rank and file. He could speak for the men on the job. What was the use of opposing the draft here in a hall where nobody but party members were present? What was wanted was for them to lift up their voices on the street, to awaken the people before it was too late. Was there anybody in this gathering bold enough to organize a street meeting? There were some who could not resist this challenge, and in a few minutes Peter had secured the pledges of half a dozen young hotheads, Donald Gordon among them. Before the evening was past, it had been arranged that these would-be martyrs should hire a truck and make their debut on Main Street the very next evening. Old hands in the movement warned them that they would only get their heads cracked by the police. But the answer to that was obvious. They might as well get their heads cracked by the police as get them blown to pieces by German artillery. Section 32. Peter reported to McGivney what was planned, and McGivney promised that the police would be on hand. Peter warned him to be careful and have the police be gentle, at which McGivney grinned and answered that he would see to that. It was all very simple, and took less than 10 minutes of time. The truck drew up on Main Street, and a young orator stepped forward and announced to his fellow citizens that the time had come for the workers to make known their true feelings about the draft. Never would free Americans permit themselves to be herded into armies and shipped overseas and be slaughtered for the benefit of international bankers. Thus far the orator had got, when a policeman stepped forward and ordered him to shut up. When he refused, the policeman tapped on the sidewalk with his stick, and a squad of 8 or 10 came round the corner, and the orator was informed that he was under arrest. Another orator stepped forward and took up the harangue, and when he also had been put under arrest, another and another, until the whole 6 of them, including Peter, were in hand. The crowd had had no time to work up any interest one way or the other. A patrol wagon was waiting, and the orators were bundled in and driven to the station house, and next morning they were haled before a magistrate and sentenced each to 15 days. As they had been expecting to get 6 months, they were a happy bunch of left-wingers. And they were still happier when they saw how they were to be treated in jail. Ordinarily it was the custom of the police to inflict all possible pain and humiliation upon the Reds. They would put them in the revolving tank, a huge steel structure of many cells which was turned round and round by a crank. In order to get into any cell, the whole tank had to be turned until that particular cell was opposite the entrance, which meant that everybody in the tank got a free ride, accompanied by endless groaning and scraping of rusty machinery. Also it meant that nobody got any consecutive sleep. The tank was dark, too dark to read, even if they had had books or papers. There was nothing to do save to smoke cigarettes and shoot craps, and listen to the smutty stories of the criminals, and plot revenge against society when they got out again. But up in the new wing of the jail were some cells which were clean and bright and airy, being only 3 or 4 feet from a row of windows. In these cells they generally put the higher class of criminals, women who had cut the throats of their sweethearts, and burglars who had got away with the swag, and bankers who had plundered whole communities. But now, to the great surprise of 5 out of the 6 anti-militarists, the entire party was put in one of these big cells, and allowed the privilege of having reading matter, and of paying for their own food. Under these circumstances martyrdom became a joke, and the little party settled down to enjoy life. It never once occurred to them to think of Peter Gudge as the source of this bounty. They attributed it, as the French say, to their beautiful eyes. There was Donald Gordon, who was the son of a well-to-do businessman, and had been to college until he was expelled for taking the doctrines of Christianity too literally, and expounding them too persistently on the college campus. There was a big, brawny lumberjack from the North, Jim Henderson by name, who had been driven out of the camps for the same reason, and had appalling stories to tell of the cruelties and hardships of the life of a logger. There was a Swedish sailor by the name of Gus, who had visited every port in the world, and a young Jewish cigar worker, who had never been outside of American City, but had traveled even more widely in his mind. The 6th man was the strangest character of all to Peter. A shy, dreamy fellow, with eyes so full of pain and a face so altogether mournful that it hurt to look at him. Duggan was his name, and he was known in the movement as the "hobo poet." He wrote verses, endless verses, about the lives of society's outcasts. He would get himself a pencil and paper, and sit off in the corner of the cell by the hour, and the rest of the fellows, respecting his work, would talk in whispers so as not to disturb him. He wrote all the time while the others slept, it seemed to Peter. He wrote verses about the adventures of his fellow prisoners, and presently he was writing verses about the jailers, and about other prisoners in this part of the jail. He would have moods of inspiration, and would make up topical verses as he went along. Then again he would sink back into his despair, and say that life was hell, and making rhymes about it was childishness. There was no part of America that Tom Duggan hadn't visited, no tragedy of the life of outcasts that he hadn't seen. He was so saturated with it that he couldn't think of anything else. He would tell about men who had perished of thirst in the desert, about miners sealed up for weeks in an exploded mine, about matchmakers poisoned until their teeth fell out, and their fingernails, and even their eyes. Peter could see no excuse for such morbidness, such endless harping upon the horrible things of life. It spoiled all his happiness in the jail. It was worse than little Jennie's talking about the war. End of sections 31 and 32.